First, I'd like to welcome you to this year's Irving Bluestone Memorial Lecture, an event to honor and celebrate the legacy of the late Irving Bluestone, a UAW leader and later Penn State faculty member, who was responsible in large part for establishing where we are today. And I don't actually mean the Reuther Library here, I mean the Fraser Center for Workplace Issues. I'm Elizabeth Fow, Director of Labor at Wayne. We have an exciting year ahead, so it's great to see you all. This event is sponsored today by the Fraser Center for Workplace Issues, the Reuther Library, and the Department of History. I want to thank Jamie McQuaid and Sean O'Brien for their work in preparing and organizing this event. I have the privilege today of introducing David Witwer, Professor of American Studies and History at Pennsylvania State University in Harrisburg. He will be presenting his lecture, Searching for Jimmy Hoffa, the Disappearance of America's Most Notorious Labor Leader and Why It Still Matters Today. I've known David since he was a young scholar, recently graduated from Brown University, in part through the North American Labor History Conference, but also as the editor of a special issue of Social Science History, in which one of his articles appeared. Soon after, in 2003, Professor Witwer published his first book, Corruption and Reform in the Teamsters Union, widely cited due to the centrality of the Teamsters in the 20th century labor movement. David Witwer's scholarship focuses on the impact of union corruption scandals on modern American politics, and it brings together the intersecting historical fields of labor, politics, journalism, and organized crime. I can see where today maybe people confuse these not really separate entities anymore. Anyway, David actually wrote a really interesting article on the labor beat, which I would direct your attention to, and really the decline of coverage of labor. And his work through his second book, The Shadow of the Racketeer, also helped to, I think, shed light on a part of the labor movement that labor historians oftentimes avoid with great reluctance, looking into issues of corruption and violence. And in this respect, I think he's been very brave to take on the kind of topics that he's pursued. Most recently, he is the author with Catherine Rios, a book called Murder in the Garment District that explores similar themes, although strangely enough, not having anything to do with Teamsters.
Yeah, that Teamsters great.
David also served as the Fulbright Bicentennial Distinguished Chair in American Studies at the University of Helsinki. His scholarship often takes us to places that historians are reluctant to go, but once we're there, we kind of enjoy it. His new study of Hoffa promises us the rich detail and probing narrative that has been the hallmark of his career. David, right?
Well, thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. So way back, so 95, that's when I first came to the North American Labor History Conference. You wouldn't believe it now, but back then I used to get carded and they didn't even take my driver's license. Say that was a thing. It's hard to imagine that now. So I'll tell you this. I was telling them I've been giving versions of the talk about the Hoffa project really since 2019. I began it. And if you know me before I came here, I expressed some nervousness because I give these talks to all different kinds of audiences, but to come here to Detroit, which to me is the home of labor history and a place where I really was fundamental in my career, it's great, it's an honor, but it felt a little gone. I want to thank Liz for inviting me, and Jamie and Sean also for really helping make the arrangements. I want to thank you all for coming. You know, like kind of 4:30, beautiful Thursday fall afternoon. So I really quite appreciate it. So I'm going to talk, maybe more than what any of us want to hear, but at the end of it, I hope there's enough time for questions, and I'm very eager to take them. So I really get a lot out of these exchanges, and I know people in this room have a lot of background and insight, so I really do hope to get them. All right, So let's start with the beginning. So my assumption was all of you know all of this already, but as John's indicated to me, I didn't have to worry about it too much. But I'm used to talking to my undergraduates don't have a strong background in labor history. So it wasn't a few years ago when I like had them read about this person that they would always refer to as Hoffa. And I realized they had no idea who this guy is. So we'll start with the very beginning. I won't assume any background. We will walk our way through and deal with some more in-depth questions. So typically what I tell students is, let's not assume anyone knows who he is. So let's say, who was Jimmy Hoffa to a group of people in a room? Some of you know very well, some have a personal connection, but basically what I tell most of the audience that I talk to, right? He was the president of the most powerful union in the US in a period of the peak of union power. It's that combination that really makes it quite significant, right? He was quite controversial and he was famous at the time, you know, for having ties to organized crime. And this is something that he was very straightforward about right up front. He would say, I do know these people. I am close to these people. They don't control me. I'm not owned by them, but these are the people that you have to work with to build a union in the places I'm building a union, and you'd be crazy if you didn't. And Liz was referring to this book, Murder in the Garment District. You know, part of the argument that we make in that book is that that really wasn't that unusual. People building unions in places like the New York City garment industry had to interact with organized crime too. And this would be true in other industries and other places. What was distinctive about Hoffa was he wouldn't prevaricate about it. He would say, these are the people I know, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know them just because I'm now an established figure. And that was controversial. He was in the news a lot. So for my students, they say, back in the olden times, this means there was like this thing that was delivered to your door with paper printed and see, there'd be news accounts of him, but he'd be in the news magazines as well, the Newsweek, Time, US News, Life, you can see there, right? But also the Sunday morning news shows. He was a gutsy guy. So he would go on Meet the Press or whatever, and he would engage with these reporters. I tell the students, I tell audiences that I talk to, I say, think of him not as a union leader, because I think people today, they think that makes him inherently obscure and a niche figure. Think of him really as a celebrity. That's what he was. He was the equivalent of a celebrity today. And just like a celebrity today was controversial, he was a guy who had fans who were fiercely devoted to him. These would be Teamsters Union members, but other union members also tended to be quite supportive of him. But he also had, also the object of fear and loathing by lots of people, which is, if you're in the cool seats, that's what that Life magazine's cover is all about. Like, that's a depiction of a guy who's depicted as a menace to American society. So he's both loved and hated. So when I first gave these talks, say in 2019, 2020, under the behest of Penn State, I had to say, so I want to think of someone that was very controversial today, that some people are crazy about, and some people see as a threat to the very foundations of society. But at the behest of Penn State, I couldn't say a particular political figure. That's like touching the third rail. So I tried to find someone who's not political that would be the same way. And these are somewhat dated. So like I sometimes try to ask my students, who can I get to replace it? But you might have to say something like Jeff Bezos. Like some people say, oh, this guy transformed the whole retail market, but he's a menace to society. And I thought that wedding in Venice was over the top. Or I was thinking politically. I mean, I was thinking sports-wise. So someone like Tom Brady a few years ago. So, if you're a Patriots fan back in the day, you think he's great. He walks on water. But if you're like my daughter, who's not a Patriots fan, you think he's good. That's somewhat dated, right? But so then I'd say, imagine this. So, July 30th, 1975, you open your newspaper and you see Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. I'm like, so imagine it's tomorrow, and it's not a newspaper, but when you open up your webpage of the news and you say, Tom Brady disappeared, or say Taylor Swift disappeared, you want something that's equally sort of controversial, that's the scale of it, right? So imagine that's the sort of headline. So let's talk about what happened. So it's July 30th, 1975. At this point, Hoffa is the former president of the Teamsters Union. He resigned in 1971. I'll tell you why later in this lecture, but he's the former president of Teamsters. And on this day, on a Wednesday afternoon at say 1:30, he leaves his house, one in the afternoon, leaves his house, and he's going to a meeting with these two people here. One is Anthony Jackalone, Tony Jackalone, who, like in the language of organized crime commissions, is described as a capo or a mid-level figure in the Detroit mob, who Hoffa's known for decades, certainly at least as far back as the 90s. And they're close. They're close socially. There's almost like a familial tie between them. And the other person that he's going to meet here is Tony Provenzano, who is also a mid-level figure, but in the Genovese crime family. He's based in New Jersey. He's also the head of Teamsters Local 560, which is one of the largest locals on the East Coast. Come on in, come on. So he's going to meet these two people who we've known for a long time, but they are organized crime figures. And so what he says is, or what we know is, the meeting is to take place at the Red Marcus Fox restaurant, not in the restaurant, but in the parking lot of the restaurant. And that restaurant was like a sort of a fancy shishi restaurant, suburbs outside of Detroit, in a busy shopping center. Like, so imagine like a strip mall shopping center, and then the restaurant's in like the parking lot of it. It's a Wednesday afternoon, lots of people going in and out. It's very busy. There's a wedding, like a wedding rehearsal dinner that's taking place there. We know he's not going in the restaurant because in olden times, that restaurant required that you had to have a tie to be seated, and he's not wearing a tie. So that what seems to have occurred is he's going to meet these people in the parking lot. And I always tell my students, I say, that's what you should do. Like, if you're going to have a meeting with a couple of mid-level organized crime figures, you don't know how it's going to go. If it goes sideways, you want to have lots of people around, which is what he did, right? So he's there, and people see him. He's prominent. Like, again, like you know, if Tom Brady was in the Red Lobster parking lot, people would say, oh, I can't help but notice that was Tom Brady. Taylor Swift is right standing right next to him, right? A few people went up to talk to him because he's famous. And they chatted with him, and they would later tell the FBI. They know they chatted with him sometime between 2:30, 2 and 2:30. And around 2:30, he calls his wife. He does not use his cell phone because they don't exist. Instead, he uses something my students don't know what it is, but it's called a payphone. And he had to cross the parking lot. He called his wife and he said, "These guys aren't here." He may have used an expletive. He may have said these guys. He was famous for not waiting for people. That's the thing. He wouldn't have waited. But he's like, I'll give them a few more minutes. And then he may have called another person, Louis Monteau, who was like the guy who should have been with him at that meeting. But then sometime after that, the FBI, they placed him between 2:45 and 3 that afternoon. People saw him, and then after 3, they don't see him. And he's never seen it. There's no scuffle. Like, if anybody had like actually assaulted him and thrown him in a car, that would have drawn attention. So whatever happens, he's there, and then he isn't, and he's never seen it back. So what happens? So the family waits for him that night. They stay up all night, and he doesn't show up. And in the morning, they call the police. Say, we don't know where he is. And then, as we covered, turns out it's the West Bloomfield police. They contact people, and they go to the restaurant parking lot, and they find his car. So then the local police begin to investigate. Eventually, the FBI becomes involved after about a week. And the claim is that there was a demand for a ransom. I don't know if that's really true, but there's so much call for the FBI to become involved with it. And it becomes a huge case. So over 200 FBI agents. If you know your 1970s history, there was right around this time, just a few months before Patty Hearst was kidnapped. That's a huge FBI case. This is sort of the next biggest FBI case. Several field officers. Eventually, really by that fall, they have a series of federal grand juries. Partly this is to lock in witness tapes. So some of those people that were in the parking lot, the notion is you want to put them before the grand jury, record their testimony so that later, for whatever reason, they don't decide to change their mind. Then suspects are also called before, right? And you can threaten them with contempt if they don't answer questions. If you're still conscious at this point, you say, I wonder about Tony Provenzano or Anthony Jackalone. It would seem like they would be key suspects. And in fact, the FBI, they talked to both, and you shouldn't be too surprised to know that both had very, very, very good alibis. So good. So very good. And both of them knew nothing about any meaning of Hoffa. Me? No, I've never heard of it. Good luck finding Hoffa because he's my really good friend and I'm really worried about it. So let me know if there's anything I can do to help. That's it. Then a series of grand juries where it's all done. There's never any arrests, no convictions, no body. So the story in the case has continued notoriety, I would say, for kind of 3 reasons. One is this, right? He's the most prominent victim of organized crime in U.S. history. That's if you don't count JFK's assassination of the mob. See that as a mob hit, then he's the second. If you want afterwards, you can ask me, are there any ties between those two? And there are rumored ties between what happens to JFK and what happens to Hoffa. I'm not going to just talk about him now because I'm trying to get us out of here by saying so. It's an unsolved case, even today, right? So what I usually tell audiences, I shouldn't tell you this because you're like in Detroit, but usually people outside Detroit, but if you see someone with slides, I'm like, I noticed like a license plate in that one photo that you had of the Marcus Red 5. You can call the Detroit FBI, and there's a guy that will actually take your report. He's not the most senior guy in the office, but there you do that, but he will take the report and you'll file it, and it's an ongoing file, right? So it continues. And it's a compelling story. It often gets retold. So most recently in The Irish. But that's just the last in a series of movies, TV miniseries, and many true crime books that I'm spending some time talking. So in today's talk, I'm going to tell you a bit about who Hoffa was and just why he was so notorious. So a bit of the backstory going back. And then I'm going to talk about why interest in his story continues today. And then I'm going to talk about something that's really the most recent chapter that I wrote for what I hope will be the book. And that is this notion of a mythic Hoffa versus the historical Hoffa. I'm spending some time on that at the very end. And this is where we'll get into where the body is. Okay. So let's start with this. Who was Hoffa and why he was so notorious? So I sort of alluded to this, but what you want to do is you want to think of the 1950s in a way that I don't think most Americans do. Most of my students, if they know anything about U.S. history and organized labor, they're like, I'm pretty sure the 1930s, there was some unions and some strikes. That must have been their peak of strength. And typically what I'd say is the modern union movement was reborn in the 1930s, right? It grows in the 30s, it grows in the 40s, but it reaches an all-time peak in the 1950s. That's the peak of union strength. So by the 1930s, unions are about 1/3 of the workforce. That's pretty impressive. But in key sectors, like in transportation and in manufacturing and in construction, unions are 80% or more of the workforce, right? And in this period of union strength, right, unions aren't afraid to go on strike, and there are lots of strikes. Because strikes are how you win gains for your union members. So strong unions go on strike and they win major gains. So for instance, in 1959, right, there was a 115-day steel strike in the U.S. Shuts down the steel industry for like 1/3 of the year. It's a hard thing to imagine today, but it was very much part of that world. And in this world of union strength, the Teamsters are the biggest, and arguably they're the strongest. Because the Teamsters in this period, right, they organized interstate trucking, but also local to local. So in the emerging supply chain economy in the 1950s, they're pivotal. And if you're trying to organize a group of workers, support from those truck drivers is key. If they honor the picket line of a group of workers that are on strike or trying to organize, that makes it much easier for that union to succeed. But if they choose not to honor that picket line, it makes it that much harder for that struggling. So they are strategically quite important. Now, in this period of union strength, it's also, perhaps not coincidentally, the all-time peak of congressional investigations of union corruption and labor racketeering. And this starts chronologically right after the 1947-1948 off-year elections. So once the Republicans gain control of Congress, you start to see congressional investigations of union corruption and labor racketeering. And people tend to think in the 1950s, they think of these investigations of communism and communist infiltration, right? And they think of the House Un-American Activities Committee or the Senate Internal Security Committee. But in fact, there were more investigations of union corruption and labor racketeering, and they were bigger investigations than the committee's investigations of communism. So there's over a dozen of them by the end of the 1950s. And they peak, really the culmination of it is at the very end of the 1950s, what comes to be called the Senate McClellan Committee after Senator John McClellan of Arkansas. It is the largest and perhaps one of the biggest investigations by Congress in U.S. history. Staff of over 100. So by comparison, the House Un-American Activities Committee has a staff of about 20. So this committee is led by this guy here, right, who is not me, right? It's Robert F. Kennedy. He's the general counsel. The guy on his left is his brother, who is John F. Kennedy, right? Barry Goldwater was on this committee. It's the movers and shakers of the Senate. This big investigation chooses as its first target the then head of the biggest union in the U.S., not Jimmy Hoffa, sadly, but in fact, Dave Beck. And what Robert Kennedy's investigators find is that Beck had used about $200,000 from the Teamsters Union treasury to kind of renovate this house that he had in Seattle. And then he sold that house to the Teamsters. And then there was a labor relations experts, like a labor relations advisor, who was basically, he was buying luxury items for Dave Beck, like fancy shirts and fancy silk socks or whatever. And then the Teamsters Union was reimbursing this guy for this purchase. So the committee calls him up to testify about this. They ask him questions. This is what you should do if you're asked about questions, something you've done wrong before a congressional committee. Take advantage of your Fifth Amendment right. He says, I respectfully decline to answer that question. The way it works by the 1950s is if you say the Fifth Amendment for one question, you have to say it for every question. You can't duck and weave. So he's on the stand for hour after hour, and essentially they read all of these items that he's been purchased, fancy silk socks, this, that, again and again and again. He's saying, I respectfully decline to answer this. It makes him look silly. It makes him look guilty as heck. And it's the end of his political career. Like within a week, he's being burned in effigy by Teamster locals across the country. He was up for re-election that fall. He announces he's not going to run for re-election. It's just like that, the end of Dave Beck. But that means the committee's next target is going to be Hoffa, because now that Beck's out, Hoffa, who was just the international vice president, is the most likely candidate to succeed Beck. And from Robert Kennedy's point of view, that's not good, because although Robert Kennedy thought that Beck was corrupt, he's really, really concerned about Hoffa's ties to organized crime. So from his point of view, I got rid of a corrupt guy, but now I put a guy in who's allied to organized crime, and that's not really good. There's also another aspect of this too, which is that Robert Kennedy knows that the lead that he got that allowed him to destroy Dave Beck came from people close to Hoffa. Essentially, if you're following this, Hoffa used Kennedy and the McClellan Committee to push Beck aside so that he could then become president. And so he's used Robert Kennedy. So what Robert Kennedy wants to do then is, and I'll say Robert Kennedy, he wants to basically take down Hoffa the same way he did that, which is find out incriminating corrupt information, call him to testify, make him take the fifth, or he has to admit to doing these terrible things in his corrupt role. But Hoffa's quite different than Beck was, right? Hoffa, by the time Beck was called to testify in early 1957, he's kind of a stuffed shirt. He doesn't really even like to think of himself as a labor leader. He's like thinks of himself as a successful executive and an investor. He didn't really have that connection to labor. But Hoffa by 1957 is a guy who's very much a devoted rank and file Teamster leader. So he led his first strike when he was a teenager, age 18 or 19. By the time he was 22, he was the head of a local union leader. He literally lives for the union. So in 1957, right, he's still working 7 days a week, 14, 15, 16 hours a day. Half of his time is flying across the country. He goes to Teamster local after Teamster local. And reporters who follow him, like he goes to these meetings, he knows more of the members' names than their local leaders. And he always stays after and he hands out his office number. And you think, well, sure, you know, like the president of Penn State says, you can always call me, my door is always open, but it isn't. But there are legions of stories of truck drivers tried to deal with their local union leader, their employer, they call Hoffa, they get through on the first call. So, what else was I going to say? Oh, the other thing about him is that he's achieved real gains for his members. Like he gets good gains in contracts for his members. So let's see if I have it here. I have a clip where you can just see a brief interview, just because much of what you see about Hoffa is that this guy is basically this mobbed up emperor. But I like to think of him more as like a kind of an annoying workaholic.
You don't play around the wall. What do you do for entertainment?
Right here work.
This is entertainment.
7 days a week, I have more fun here working than anybody will have on the golf course of any sports arena. Every minute here. There's something new, something keeps you alert. It's competing with the best friends in the United States.
All right. So then what you have are a series of appearances, right? So Kennedy calls Hoffa to testify. He'll end up testifying 4 times before the McClellan Committee comes to him, more than anybody else is called to testify. They spend more resources investigating him, the Teamsters, than any others. But the outcome is quite different. First of all, Hoffa never takes the Fifth Amendment. This is a gutsy move because he'll tell reporters, like, I'm no angel. We've definitely done stuff wrong. But what he's hoping is he can always outsmart Robert Kennedy. And the deal is, right, you can't lie. And once you start answering questions, you have to answer questions. And if you choose not to answer a question, then you're charged with contempt. So it's a gutsy move. He's not always straightforward, sometimes evasive, but it's a bold move. On the other hand, Kennedy spends enormous amounts of resources, tons and tons and tons of manpower hours. They never find a smoking gun in corruption. They never find a case where there is an employer who paid Hoffa and in return got a softer contract or the contract wasn't enforced. They never find a case where money was taken out of the union and was used to benefit Hoffa. Just doesn't exist. There wasn't a clear-cut case like that at all. So instead of that, right? Instead of that, what Robert Kennedy spends lots of time questioning about Hoffa is this: his ties to people who are clearly in organized crime or associated organized crime, and the fact that there are Teamster leaders who he either supports or promotes or protects who have ties to organized crime or criminal records. So it's back and forth on that. And Hoffa will say, you don't know what you're talking about. These are tough people. We're dealing with tough employers. It's a very fiery set of exchanges. And I think I have a clip here so you can see it. Yeah, it becomes like a duel.
You say anything to the effect that the jury treated you very well, and that you thought that you would do very well before a jury.
I know that's pretty ridiculous.
Did you say anything like that?
I appeal to the chair. I best be taken out of the ring.
You've got people in Detroit, at least 15 with police records. You've got Joey Bledsoe in Chicago. I think you're not tough enough to get rid of these people.
But Hoffa was contemptuous. He denied any wrongdoing, taunting the crusading young investigator.
Did you say that SOB, I'll break his back?
Who?
You.
Say to who?
To anyone.
Take your speech. I don't even know what I was talking about. I know what you're talking about.
Well, Mr. Hoffa, all I'm trying to find out, I'll tell you what I'm talking about. I'm trying to find out whose back you were going to break.
Take your speech. Take your speech.
So this pursuit takes Hoffa, who wasn't per se famous before the McClellan Committee goes after him, and it makes him into a prominent public figure, right? So this is when all the news coverage comes. This is when he's on the news magazines. So he becomes notorious, and he becomes, for the public, he becomes the symbol of the threat of union corruption. But in this case, right, not portrayed as something that's necessarily just bad for union members, but this notion of union corruption as a menacing aspect of union power. That's a threat not just to members, but to the country as a whole. So like, if you're in the cool seat, you can see like, this is Hoffa, kind of oddly dressed like the Statue of Liberty, but he's literally holding the whip hand over Uncle Sam. And there's others where he's like driving like one of those steamroller things, and he's driving it over Uncle Sam. There's lots of depictions of him as a Roman emperor. 1959, this culminates in a bill that limits union power in two key ways, the Lander-Griffin Act. So it imposes new restrictions on the use of organizing strikes and on the secondary boycott. And when that bill is proposed and when it's passed, people like John F. Kennedy support it, and they say it's a law that will put Jimmy Hoffa out of business. So it becomes the symbol of the menace of union power. Now, 1959, the McClellan Committee comes to an end. 1960, John F. Kennedy runs for president and wins. 1961, Robert Kennedy becomes the new Attorney General. And one of his first priorities is to use the powers of the Department of Justice to win a conviction of Hoffa. So he forms what comes to be known informally within the Department of Justice as the Get Hoffa Squad. A group of prosecutors, investigators, trying to pull together any way possible of winning an indictment against Hoffa or one of his close allies, and then winning a conviction. There's several failed efforts, and then in 1964, they get two convictions. One is for jury tampering, and that's like 8 years, and then a second one for mail fraud that has to do with the Teamsters pension. So he's sentenced to 13 years total in federal prison. He appeals it, but in 1967, he ends up going to federal prison. We were in Pennsylvania, which is where I'm from. I said he's just down the road in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. But when he goes to prison in 1967, he goes to prison in 1967 as the president of the largest union in the U.S. Because even after his conviction in 1966, he was reelected by huge margins by the Teamsters. And he continues to be quite popular despite those two convictions, right? Part of it is, despite all the criticism from Robert Kennedy, wages, benefits, contract gains for Teamster members have been quite good all during Hoffa's presidency. So there's this notion that he takes care of his members and they appreciate the real gains that he's achieved. It's also the case, right, that there is just this about his manner. Like, he's a guy that never put on air. So he lives in the late 1950s, early 1960s. They live in this house that they bought at the end of the 1930s. It's a teeny tiny little bungalow. Like, I found the address in like one of the FBI reports. I Googled it, it's still there. It's this row of really small houses. And there's nothing fancy about it. Like reporters talk about, when Life magazine reporters talk about it, it's like when you go to his dining room and sit in it, you can like touch one wall with hand and the other wall with the other hand. And like he's famous, I don't know if you can see it here, but even when he testified before Congress, he would always still wear the same white socks with a suit. Like, dark socks make my feet itch, so I feel comfortable. I think one Teamster member from Detroit told a New York Times reporter, he said, "Why do you still like Hoffa?" Hoffa speaks my language. And then there's just this case that for lots of rank and file members, like that sense that Hoffa is being selectively prosecuted by Robert Kennedy, that really resonates. Like, he really does look like someone who's being persecuted. And Hoffa would say, "I'm being persecuted because I'm so good at defending the rights of labor." Maybe, but it's definitely, lots of people look at what was going on with Robert Kennedy and it smells like selective prosecution. And in our world right now, we know just how easily that's done. There's something really quite fishy about it. All right, so final chapter. 1971, he resigned from all of his Teamster Union. And it was because he'd been denied probation or parole several times. And the sense was that he was never going to get out of federal prison before 1980 unless he stepped down from the union presence. So he resigned. And then later that year, Richard Nixon commutes the sentence. There is a connection between this and Watergate that I'll tell you if you ask me about, but I won't go into it right now. But basically, when he gets released, one of the restrictions is he gets out in December 1971, but he's not supposed to have anything to do with the union until 1980. Which he seems to accept when he gets out of prison, but then he doesn't so much accept it. So he decides that he will run for the Teamsters presidency at the next convention of the election of the Teamsters, which is in 1980. But now Now he's opposed by what had been his former allies in organized crime. They, like his successor, a guy named Frank Fitzsimmons, who was quite simply, from the point of view of organized crime, easier to work with, more pliant. And so they say, we don't really want you to run, we don't support you. People like Provenzano, who had been key supporters of Hoffa, are not supporters of Hoffa. And so what we think is that meeting, July 30th, 1975, was at least partly to try to resolve that, find a way to end that opposition. And so whatever happened, that clearly didn't resolve it. All right, now that disappearance, and here's where we're going to talk about the mythic Hoffa, that transforms him from a notorious union leader into a mythic, right? So the fact is, there's no body, right? No resolution, but there are repeated leads. I'll spend lots of time telling you about in the years that follow. And those repeated leads, those repeated stories and claims and excavations, they keep the story alive. But at the same time, right, Hoffa's like these other famous disappearances, like Amelia Earhart or the lost colony of Roanoke or D.B. Cooper, if that name means anything to you. These are stories that don't have any real ending. So they're always available for retelling. You could create a blockbuster movie and say, this is what happened to him, and not worry that it conflicts with reality, because nobody actually knows what the real story is. So those stories are there. So part of what myth is that notion that it's a variation from what we know for certain. That mythic Hoffa then, I'm going to argue, is bound up with recurring claims about where the body actually is located, and then these periodic high-profile excavations. They keep the interest alive, but I'm going to argue that they shape the meaning of what mythic Hoffa is. And here's just a thing I want to tell you, and then I'll say at the very end. If you think about it, right, mythic Hoffa dates back to 1975. In some ways, he's been around longer than the actual Hoffa held union office. And for most Americans, mythic Hoffa is the only union leader they actually know. So who mythic Hoffa is in some ways as significant, if not more significant, than who Hoffa actually was before him. Right. So the most recent excavation I could find was at a what used to be a Major League Baseball field in Milwaukee. In 2023, a group called the Cold Case Squad, which was like retired police and some journalists, they came up with the idea based on really on this playing card that they found that had like it had a notation that essentially was Milwaukee Brewers 1995 third base. And based on that, they came up with the idea that in 1995, in the middle of the Major League Baseball season, Hoffa's body had been moved from where it previously was and put under what was the third base in the Milwaukee Brewers. Then later on, the baseball field was knocked down, and then they put in a parking lot, and then they put in a little league field. And so in 2023, they took ground penetrating radar and they found an anomaly under there, and then a cadaver dog went right to that spot where the third base was in. So they wanted the FBI to excavate it. But just the year before that, the FBI did excavate what was a location underneath the Pulaski Skyway, what used to be what's called in the 1970s was the Brother Moscato landfill. But they did an excavation there for several days, the whole backhoe dug, looking for what they had been led to believe was the site where Hoffa was buried, and they didn't find a spot. And those are just the two most recent, right? And for all I know, maybe one's occurred in this one. Didn't catch up. Now, that history of excavations and claims really go all the way back to August 1975. So in the immediate aftermath of Hoffa's visit. And they recurred on a regular basis in the intervening 50 years. So excavations, but also people coming forward and claiming that they know what happened to Hoffa. And what I'm going to argue is that those searches, those claims, they keep interest in Hoffa's story alive. But I also argue that they shape the meaning of what Hoffa's myth is. So let's start with the basic pattern of what occurs. So there's a pattern of these searches and claims. They start with this. They start with a trigger, which is someone with alleged organized crime ties, maybe also ties to Hoffa, but that actually isn't always required. they claim to know the true story of the murder. There's a couple of things here, like, it turns out, what's your name? Erica?
Sarah.
Sarah. It turns out Sarah could claim to have ties to organized crime. But the very nature of those claims are really negatives, right? Like, I have a degree from Brown University, that's something that's certifiable. I have ties to the Genovese crime family, that's not so certifiable, right? I'm a serial hitman, but I do it so well, you don't know it because I've never been caught. These are in fact claims that get made all the time. And then I, a serial hitman with ties to the Genovese crime family, know that Hoffa is buried underneath, this building back in my hometown. But you can't prove that's not true because we've never found his body. So it's a kind of claim that can't really be contested. Now, why would you make that kind of claim? Back in the 1970s, like if you look at the FBI reports, some people were making it as a way to get out of prison or look for leniency from the FBI, some bid for clemency, sometimes for money. So really by like November 1975, already CBS News was taken for like $10,000 by a guy who claimed that they knew where Hoffa was. $10,000 was more money back then. The Permanent Subcommittee of Investigations was taken for like $200,000 that October. Most common though is use it to promote a true crime. So you were an organized crime. Now you're telling all to a journalist, make this book. That book is going to get more sales, more attention if you also include a claim that you know what happened. So one example of that, I use this maybe because it's a Detroit thing, but this guy here, Marvin the Weasel Elkine, was an organized crime figure, born in Toronto, spent some time in Montreal, also in New York City. Book comes out in 2011, lots of claims that can't be verified. And amongst them, like he says in the 1950s, he was like a busboy at the Copacabana, and Fat Tony Salerno and Tony Pro saw him and he said, "Kid, we think you'd be great to be a driver for Jimmy Hoffa when he comes to New York City." And then when he drove Hoffa through New York City, he would stop, and then he would pick up like Sam Giancana and then other large mafia leaders. And Hoffa would say, "Marvin, if you have any ideas, just chime in. Offer us anything you have." That's not verifiable, right? And there's nothing to back it up. And then he also says, I have it in my notes, I think it's in 19. This is what you guys would know. In 19. Yeah. Yeah, so 1985, he was at a Teamsters conference in Detroit. And amongst the people who were at the Teamsters conference in Detroit was Anthony Giacalone. And Anthony Giacalone, while he was at the Teamsters conference with Elkine, said, "By the way, I killed Hoffa. I mean, I was behind Hoffa's murder. Here's how it was done." And then later on, when they're walking by the Renaissance Center, he says, "This is where he is. So say hi to Hoffa." And then describe how Hoffa was put in the foundation. I'll talk about this later, but maybe I'll just give it away now. There's lots of issues with that. One, since Giacalone wasn't a Teamster or a Teamster official, it's not clear why he would have been at a Teamster conference. But even if they let him in, it would be even more problematic because in 1985 he was in federal prison. But Elkine's book is filled with this, right? And it's part of what draws attention. And then if you've ever seen a list of possible locations where Hoffa might be, the Renaissance Center is always listed. And this is part of the attention that Elkine gets. Another key part of the pattern is that excavations, when they do look for Hoffa, those are high-profile events. You can tie this out after this talk, like go out and dig for Hoffa's body somewhere. You got to have a backhoe. There's usually state police involved. Once you're doing this digging, then the local news channels are going to come by. They'll have helicopters flying overhead. Already in August 1975, you have high-profile events. October, there's a major one led by the Permanent Subcommittee Investigation. But I think I have a clip here. You can see a series of them. In Detroit, this is probably old news.
We, the FBI and local law enforcement have taken a crack at a handful of tips over the last 10 years. In Michigan, 4 confirmed investigations made the news. In July of 2003, there was a search in Hampton Township near Bay City. Police were digging under a backyard swimming pool for a briefcase. A tipster had told them it contained evidence that Hoffa had been murdered with drugs or poison. Nothing was found. Less than a year later, in June of 2004, investigators looked for clues at a home on Detroit's northwest side. They tore up the floorboards at a house at Beaverland and Curtis. They received a deathbed tip from an ex-Teamsters president from Delaware. Again, no luck. In May of 2006, the FBI investigated a tip that Hoffa's remains were buried on an 89-acre horse farm in Milford Township. This was arguably the most extensive search, a price tag of more than $250 grand. The dig lasted 2 weeks. The FBI brought in heavy equipment, archaeologists, and anthropologists. No remains were found. Last September, police turned their attention to a home in Roseville. Investigators had used a ground radar and detected what they called an anomaly under the driveway. But after taking soil samples, MSU forensic experts determined no human remains were there. Of course, there have been rumors over the years that Hoffa's remains were buried under Giant Stadium in New Jersey, thrown in a swamp in Florida, and even sealed in the foundation of the Rens Center in Detroit.
So basically, any report of a dig for Hoffa gets coverage. Like in the language of journalism, that story has legs. Or it's, I guess in today's world, like we say it's clickbait, right? So like my favorite, let's see if I have here yet. There's a rural county in Missouri where they have these clay pits where they originally had dug for clay. Now they're filled with water. In 1989, there was someone called in a report to the local sheriff that there were 2 bodies that were in one of the trunks in an abandoned car on the bottom of the clay pit. The sheriff, for reasons that are really quite obscure, decided that one of those bodies was Hoffa's. So they started pulling up cars out of this clay pit. They pulled 12 cars out. There were no bodies there. But this is huge news. Like suddenly there's this sheriff in the middle of nowhere is getting called by daylight. Newspapers all over the country. So yeah, so they're big news. What's another part of the pattern? The claimed corpse locations are often high profile, quite distinct, right? So the best known one is in 1989, Donald Franco's claim that Hoffa was buried near the end zone of Giant Stadium, off section 107. And even people that I meet in other sections, like people when I play bridge with, they don't know who Hoffa is, but they know that he's buried in Giant Stadium. Like this is what they remember. And that's one of just many, right? So other examples below New Jersey's Pulaski Skyway, ground up, trucked in a barrel, and then dumped from the Florida Everglades. Always like the most distinctive location. Like, I don't know about you, but like, if I kill Hoffa, I'm not going to put him in a barrel and truck him across the country. I'm going to find a convenient, obscure location. But if I'm trying to sell a true crime memoir, I'm going to have that body placed in its thing. And then the claims require suspension of disbelief, right? So there's the credibility issue of those making the claims, right? Typically, they're in organized crime or they're saying they're in organized crime. By the very nature of them, they are dishonest, right? Because you can't be honest and be in organized crime. And if you're lying saying that you're in organized crime, then you're even more dishonest. And Donald Franco's is a classic example. So he claimed to have been a serial hitman, but there's like no actual evidence and he couldn't give any names. And he says that he killed Hoffa, like he was one of the team that killed Hoffa in July 1975. He was actually doing a 7-year jail sentence throughout the 1970s. He claims that in fact he killed like 8 or 9 people while he was in jail. He would just get unofficial furloughs, go out, commit the murder, and come back. Claimed he was in witness protection, but he wasn't. So major issues with that. Most spectacular claims, of course, defy logic. Like, why would you take Hoffa's body from some other location and move it to a Major League Baseball field in the middle of Major League Baseball field season? It doesn't make any sense. But the more spectacular the claim, right, the more it gets coverage, the more coverage, the more your aim is going to achieve. So, if you want to sell true crime memoirs, that's how you do it. Now, what we have is a mythic Hoffa who's the product of these excavations and these true crime memoirs. And the thing about that Hoffa is, like, a key part of them, what you'll always learn about when you read the stories is there's lots of potential locations for the body. Now, Hoffa disappears in 1975. That coverage, say in July and August, maybe September and October, you learn something about Hoffa. But the Hoffa that they're looking for in that baseball field in Milwaukee in 2023, all you learn about that Hoffa is really that that corpse has been moving around and been looked for in lots of different ways. You don't learn about Hoffa, the union leader. You don't learn about a union movement that emerged in the 30s that used to be here. That's not union. This Hoffa is a figure of fun, right? He's the butt of jokes about being buried in Giant Stadium or hide and go seek guy from 1973. When they're looking for him in Milford, right? The local bakery makes Hoffa cupcakes, which have his hand reaching out like from the grave. He's a lot of fun. And a lot of their jokes sort of play with the idea of immense mafia power. But the notion is he's a humorous character. Historic Hoffa was not funny. He wasn't actually all that fun, and it typically was seen as kind of menacing. It's quite different than this guy. This mythic Hoffa is a mobster. He's not a laborer. So you could say historic Hoffa was someone who definitely had ties to some people who were in organized crime. But he also had ties to people who were in the Socialist Party. He also had ties to people who were active in the Civil Rights Movement. He also had ties to people who were like trying to transform the AFL-CIO into a very different kind of movement. And he was a very diverse, very complex character. But that doesn't come through in this. This Hoffa is a mobster who likes to have people near him who kill other people. Serial hitman. And part of what's going on is that mythic Hoffa, right? The main source that we encounter him is true crime memoirs. So, you know, The Irishman is based on this book, I Heard You Paint Houses, which purports to be Frank Sheeran's story. Frank Sheeran was a corrupt Teamster leader in Philadelphia, but according to the book, he was also a serial hitman, quite prolific. Again, no specifics to back that up. But he describes that if you know the story of the book, right? Like that phrase, I heard you paint houses, that's his first conversation with Hoffa. If you've seen the movie or the book, the notion is Hoffa's put on the phone with them, and Hoffa says, I heard you paint houses, which is, according to Sharon, code for I know you kill people for a living. And Frank Sheeran says yes, and Hoffa says that's great, and now I need you near me. Because of course Hoffa needs a serial hitman as his right-hand man because he's having people killed right and left. That just isn't true. Like, he was no angel, and definitely he was in some violent fights in the 30s and 40s. And maybe for all I know, he ordered some beatings too in the 50s and 60s, but there's no murder case. Believe me, if there was a whiff of murder, Robert Kennedy would have been all over it in a second. That just isn't a thing. But it's the story of all these true crime members. All of them, based on that notion that they knew Hoffa and they were close to Hoffa because what he was about was murder. So this Hoffa, the Hoffa then that comes through in these reports that you read about, you know, even in 2023 in these excavations, right? He's a guy, you don't even know what he does for these. He's like a union warlord. Yeah, okay, right. So in 2003, this TV show, The Mythbusters, looked for Hoffa in Giant Stadium. When they covered this in newspapers, they say, July 30th, 1975, this is the only bio you get of who Hoffa was. A mobbed up former Teamster warlord disappeared. That's who he is. And that's the only story. And even if you look at the New York Times, their coverage of that excavation, like in 2022, in Pulaski, they don't say much more than this. So here's, I guess what I'm saying is the point I made at the beginning, you know, what you have then for most Americans is not historic Hoffa. They don't know who that guy is. The only Hoffa they know is this mythic Hoffa. And that mythic Hoffa is a mobbed up Teamster warlord. And for most Americans, I like to think it's different in Detroit, but most Americans I encounter, the only union leader's name who they know is Hoffa. And so in a real way, he stands for all union leaders. And if the only leader they know is this mythic Hoffa, who was a mobbed up union warlord, that says something about union power. And every time there's a debate about trying to find a way to make it easier for unions to organize, that menace of union power in the form of a mythic Hoffa gets invoked to try to throw it back. And this last thing I'll say is, in the chapter I was arguing, imagine a counterfactual. So let's say July 30th, 1975, Hoffa goes missing. 4 days later, his body's found in the trunk of a car in the long-term parking at Detroit Airport, which is the way it used to be. That'd be a very different story, right? That Hoffa who died and you found his body, you would know he was killed by organized crime. And if he was killed by organized crime, then the assumption was he was killed not because he was a stooge of organized crime, but because he wasn't a stooge. Otherwise, why kill him? And then, I'm not saying he'd be a labor martyr, but he would at least stand for the difficult choices that union leaders had to make in those kinds of industries. And there would be no mythic Hoffa. When Martin Scorsese comes around and wants to spend $150 million to make a movie, he's not going to make it about mobbed up union leaders based on a Hoffa story. He'll make it about somebody else, but he won't have that. And that's my last. Then I have something. So I'd be happy for any questions or comments. Yes.
What was the Watergate connection to that?
Very good question. So the idea is this, and it's not that far fetched, is that the person who succeeds Hoffa, this guy Frank Fitzsimmons, he wants Hoffa to get out of prison because the members want Hoffa to get out. They feel he was unfairly convicted, but he doesn't want Hoffa to be a threat and replace him as Teamsters president. So he wants the pardon, but he wants that pardon to include the wording that Hoffa can't have anything to do with the union until 1980. And to make that happen, then the Teamsters raised unofficial cash money and contributed to the committee to re-elect. Some people say $500,000, some people say $1 million. All right. Then, if you know the story of Watergate, sort of a few days after the break-in, there's a meeting in the Oval Office. I think it's with Nixon and Haldeman, and they're discussing raising hush money for the burglars so that they won't cooperate. You have to pay their lawyers, but then pay them money. But you can't you have to get it. It has to be cash, and it has to be from the place. And you can hear Nixon on the tape say, "Well, we could get it from the Teamsters, $1 million." And the notion is he wouldn't have thought of that if he hadn't already got it. Now, in the late 70s, and this is more than what you want to know, in the late 70s, if you look at the FBI files, there's this whole thing where they go deep, deep, deep down into this notion that there was a conspiracy involving Provenzano and one of Nixon's, this is like most nefarious attorneys, that guy Chuck Colson, and a payment that way, and that the cover up for that payment may have been the motive for eliminating Hoffa. But it seems like the informant they were using, which is the same informant that says that Hoffa was trucked to the Pulaski Skyway, this guy Ralph Picardo, it seems like in this case, everything that Picardo said just didn't match up. It just didn't have the goods. Yeah.
So the image of the mafia, and it maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like there at least was a period where Americans were curious, and there was some cool factor to it with the God. I think about the God.
I was going to mention that.
Yeah. And so I think of Hoffa, and you even say that they couldn't get rid of him because even though he acknowledged he had ties to the mafia, people in the union loved him because he was a serious union leader and really dedicated his life to them. So does that all really get erased because of connections with the mafia? Why is he tied to the menacing aspect of the mafia and not the sort of more cool
Yeah,
aspect of the mafia?
yeah. I mean, I think even if you think about The Godfather, right, which is, it is that cool aspect of the mafia, right? But it's actually a pretty menacing depiction of the mafia. And so when you look at reviews that came out of The Godfather in the 1970s, like we think of them as pretty cool, but what people are saying in their reviews is this shows the sort of dark side of American society. And if you think about what I'm actually making students watch The Godfather this semester, so actually I spend more time thinking about this than a normal person would. And I spend more time in the movie than a normal person would. But you know, like the notion of The Godfather of the movie, right, is that they seem cool and they seem like a nice family, or they seem like businessmen, but in fact they are utterly ruthless killers. So it is like there's a cool aspect. So I think one of the people who wrote about organized crime in the 70s, that they talk about this notion of mafia mystique. And so there is a kind of mythic quality to the mafia, which is I think what you're talking about, right? So it doesn't make it totally negative. And I think you're right, like to the extent that Hoffa is plugged in that way, it's not a wholly negative thing in the 70s. But my students don't even know what The Godfather movie is. I make them watch it, and by the way, they don't really like the aesthetics. It's kind of slow paced for them, you know. They much rather watch Scorsese. Yeah. And also, like I should say, you know, like the Hoffa of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, a menacing figure, some people refer to him more as like one of that early generation of anti-heroes. So yeah, that notion that he had ties to organized crime in the 50s, that notion that he was like an anti-Walter Reuther, that isn't wholly a negative strike against him. Yeah, that's for sure. But say move that forward to the 2000s, when I don't think people have that larger context, it just means he's a corrupt, mobbed up. Yeah.
So I think embedded in the story that you're telling there is kind of this nature that one of the reasons a lot of people today don't trust unions, union power, is the mythic Hoffa figure. And they keep being told to sell these stories and move this, but in a system of capitalism, in a system where narratives are often used to tell propaganda and shape a narrative, how much of this is just the mythic nature of storytelling, the power of the creative imagination, versus a useful tool to keep people distrusting?
Yeah. I have a code phrase I use in my class. I said that's a good question, which means I don't have the answer. Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, but like when I watch The Irishman, you know, my reaction is visceral. You know, like so much money to spend on a movie that does nothing but denigrate working class Americans. It's just like $150 million. It could have done so many other things. And I don't know that much about Martin Scorsese. I just don't know why it would have been that important for him to do that, or maybe he doesn't think about it. But you know, I'll just go off on my dog trap, go to your special place while I go off on it. But like, you know, the only Teamsters that you meet in that entire movie, right, is like Frank Sheeran, and then Tony Provenzano, and then Hoffa. And the only thing the union does is protect Sheeran when he steals from his employer. And then the only person who speaks in favor of the union is Sheeran's like grade school daughter, Peggy, to her like third grade class. She actually says what the union's doing, but they intersperse that scene with Hoffa meeting with a mobbed up casino owner who wants $15 million. And so Hoffa turns to Sheeran and say, well, go give him that money. And then Sheeran walks to the other part of Hoffa's office, which I guess is where they store all their pension money in mythic Hoffa land, and hands him like stacks of money at the same time that Peggy's making the talk. So it's saying to the viewer, she's so stupid. Only a grade school girl would believe the union stands for anything. I mean, in fact, the reality is, it's just a cover for the mafia. And you didn't have to make that movie, like, you could have made a very different movie. It makes, like, the one with, Jack Nicholson in '92, it makes it look like quite positive. Believe me, when I saw that movie, I wasn't very happy. Yeah.
So I think this is a really good question and sort of the flip side of what you're saying. It's evident why this is a useful teaching, this sort of method Hoffa is an interesting teaching tool for correcting a historical record. But do you think there are opportunities also for revising understanding the union power? Have you found that it's helpful in showing students how that record has been misconstrued and sort of leading to opportunities for different conversations about what power can and should be and why and where it was undermined?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it is, right? I do think that's true. And so I think your world is different than mine. Like, I'm at Penn State and I don't teach labor history. So the course I'm teaching where we see the Godfather and the Irishman is like organized crime in film and society. But they have to have me teach it. And so, you know, at the end of the last time I taught it, like, students were more aware of who Hoffa was and what he had done that was positive for workers than definitely they were at the start. So in that sense, there is a correction. Like, I think, you know, who knows? The teacher, how much impact you have, but there were at least 7 or 8 that really could see something different to that story. Yeah, so I do think it's available, you know? So, and this maybe isn't totally disconnected, but one of the chapters in my book is from when I was in Finland for the year. I was looking for a comparative figure in Finland, so basically a Finnish version of Jim Collins. And I don't know if you know anything about it, should, but it has a really powerful union movement. So even today, I think 70% of the workers are union. So it's really always has a strong labor movement, really since the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But it also has very low rates of corruption. And I'm not going to say no organized crime, but not the history of organized crime that we have. So there was this guy. He wasn't the head of a truck drivers union, but the equivalent in Finland was he was the head of the sailors. So in Finland, it's really pivotal that goods are transported by ship. And what he did was, like, the menace of Hoffa for someone like Robert Kennedy, they talked about in that Life magazine, is that he could have called a nationwide trucking strike that would have brought the country to its knees. So like always that threat, that menacing threat of union power. And so, you know, that's the menace, and then corrupting terror. So this guy's name was Neo Valery, and what he could do was he could declare a strike of the icebreakers, and then that would freeze up all the harbors, and it really would bring the country to a standstill. There's a big difference. Hoffa never called such a strike, and he always said, "I never would," because it's way expensive, and they would shut it down anyway, and it doesn't make any sense. But Nilo Valery called icebreaker strikes all the time. And he won major gains for his members for that. So Hoffa gets depicted as, you know, this menacing Roman emperor figure. Nilo Valery is basically just a couple years older. He's like a kind of kind grandfatherly figure. Like it's a much more positive image of union power. And I think because in Finland, there is no historic tie, no historic connection between union power and union corruption. And there's no history of groups like the McClellan Committee, where that whole series of investigative committees in the 50s, but they go back in the 30s, and actually you could go back to the late 1800s. There's a similar pattern of investigation that way. So you have union power. Not everybody loves it, but it doesn't have that shadowy, menacing depiction that it does in the U.S. The long-winded question. Yeah.
Do you think, like, I forgot the guy's name, so in Finland.
Yeah.
Like, you think because of this organized crime here in the United States and like just the mythicizing of it, like Jimmy Hoffa's story and like how it was mythicized, you think that has a part to play in it? Because I'm pretty sure Finland doesn't have the same, they don't have the same reputation for organized crime. And on top of that, I obviously there were unions in Finland, but I didn't think it was like that. I'm expecting Finland to be like a perfect place.
Yeah. Well, all right, here's another example. which is another chapter now. So sadly, you guys, like, if you come in 2019, I didn't have a chapter written, so I went after like the labor. But so there's a place called Canada, there somewhere. And there was a Jimmy Hoffa of Canada, his name was Hal Banks, and that was like his labor title, and it was the same time as Hoffa. And Hal Banks actually did have ties to organized crime, like in Montreal. He was actually brought up to be the head of the Seafarers Union in Montreal. And there, you know, it's a quite different history. It happens about the same time as Hoffa here, but there, like Hal Banks is using violence to kind of take over, you know, like the boat engineers union, shipping union. And he's a nefarious figure, just saying, he's a negative figure. And he does have, you know, real ties to organized crime. And there, the interesting thing is, the Canadian government has no interest in investigating. Partly because he was anti-communist, so he got rid of like his communist-affiliated Seafarers Union. But also, there's no history in Canada like there is in the US of people scoring political points, using the investigation of crime and organized crime to curtail it. It just isn't anything that happens. And so, ironically, in Canada, the only way there's an investigation of Hal Banks is the labor unions on their own, because they're so tired of this guy preying on them, they stage a strike on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And they shut it down until the Canadian government agrees to investigate Hal Banks. And then when they investigate Hal Banks, the notion is it's an investigation that's partly sponsored by Canadian organized labor, but it just focuses on Hal Banks, right? So when the McConnell Committee investigates corruption, it's tainting the entire labor. But when the Canadian government investigates Hal Banks, they're very specific. They're only going to look at Hal Banks. And they're only going to look at what he does in this specific situation. And it never spreads any further. And so I get what you're saying. I get, like, you know, it'd be a better comparison if there was like a mafia in Finland, and I'd say Nilo Battery was tied to the mafia in Finland, but it doesn't become the same. But I think it is also the case that it is what a country chooses to investigate and how they choose to investigate that shapes our perception of the nature of corruption and crime. And so historically in the US, going back to the 1890s, there's been a way of using these investigations to taint labor in a way that wouldn't have occurred elsewhere. Yeah.
There are two other massive investigations going on in the 50s and 60s, one of which is obviously communist, but the other of which was Congress gets very invested in looking at federalism and seeing it as something, again, that may be related to these other things, but seems to also indicate some sort of fundamental evil or weakness in workers and labor.
Yeah.
So what's the second thing?
Excuse me?
The second thing that they investigated.
Feather bedding. It's when there are theoretically more workers on the job than would be. And they look at construction, railroads, a couple of other industries. But it's always fascinating to me because they put those three things together.
Right.
And how can you actually have good labor?
Right. Yeah.
I thought the discussion of Hoffa and the mafia's reputation for kind of cleaning union labor is very interesting. Coming from Youngstown, how it was kind of gets the reputation for being a murder town in the 70s, they're obviously connected to. I was wondering if there was any connection, because I've recently been studying the Teamsters in the 60s and their battles with splinter groups, which eventually escalated into kind of shootouts outside of Republic Steel. I was wondering if there's any connection there, if maybe like Youngstown's reputation with this mafia people kind of overlaps.
Yeah, so I didn't encounter like Youngstown in that. So, you know, the thing I know that sort of intersects with that is really all through Dan Moldea's book, you know, that Teamster Rebels one, which is the first one he writes. And he has a lot about the FASH, like the Fraternal Association of Steel Haulers, and that sort of system over there. But that's the most that I know about it, and really only through reading Moldea's book. Sorry.
No,
the Pennsylvania connection, right? So Russell Buffalino. Go ahead.
Yeah, are there any labor organizers present day that you would say maybe would kind of be like a Jim Hoffa, and then also you feel and just in your professional opinion about I think it's Chris Morris, do you feel like he's being targeted?
Who's Chris Morris?
He is.
Here's what I should tell you, like, I know nothing about the current world. This is what I would tell myself, like, teach organized crime, I don't know anything about organized crime in the last 20 years, and even then, maybe last 30 years, so.
Well, the big started, or jump started the, Amazon when they decided to.
Okay. And was he then targeted for?
Well, he was originally a part of like a humanitarian aid effort, and the vessel that they were on, they spent some time abroad internationally, and they kind of feel like they have been others, were targeted.
Yeah, so you see, I know nothing about it. So, yeah. And then I don't know, like, you know, it's, if you think about the current Teamster president, which again, I know nothing about, right? But he's very like, he's very outside the existing mold, and his willingness, you know, to endorse Trump, that's a kind of out of the box, odd move that Hoffa would have done. Like, oddly enough, you know, like Hoffa endorses Nixon in 1960 when nobody else in the labor movement does it. Mainly he does it because he hates the Kennedys. But and I don't know anything really about her, Brian, so I should just shut up right now, but apparently that's not what I'll do. So here's what I discovered about Hoffa when I was writing about Nilo Valerie. It's kind of weird that I discovered he was a syndicalist, which is not a label that they would have used in the 50s. But what he really believed was the power of unions was going to come from the union's strength of its workers, not through a political alliance. So he was not going to depend on the Democrats. He was not going to depend on the Republicans. And he thought me and the AFL-CIO and their desire to find some way to use the Democrats to achieve, he thought they were suckers. So I don't know if that's what O'Brien thinks, others do, but that's what I think Hoffa was about. Yeah.
So if I can expand on that, so the current general president, one, we didn't endorse anybody at the national level.
Okay.
We had Trump come, and that's what obviously aggravated everybody, that he won't spoke at their obviously convention. But the best way I can equate it would be is that Sean more fits the mold of what James R. Hoffa was, because Sean is engaged with the membership. He does travel country.
Okay.
He is everywhere. He goes to every joint council, which joint councils oversee the locals in the states. Sean is all over the place. If you ask him to show up on a strike line, or just the Cornwall nurses that we just organized here, the 10,000, he come out, General Secretary Treasurer has come out. So Sean is more like James R. Hoffa from that standpoint, because he is everywhere. He goes everywhere. He's constantly flying and visiting every convention I show up to, whether it's Minneapolis, Kansas City. Sean shows up, he speaks for an hour, he shakes hands with people, he's back on a plane, and now he's back in California. So I mean, he is, in that sense, a lot like James R. Hoffa.
And controversial too, right?
Very controversial.
Yeah.
Yes, he's going to speak his mind.
Yeah.
He has no problems going on podcasts.
Yeah.
He has no problems telling people what it is.
Yeah.
Of course, you see his T-shirt that he wears all now. This is Teamsters versus everybody. He wears his T-shirt all the time that he kind of borrowed from Detroit. Yeah, he'll speak his mind. He might not like what he has to say, but he's going to tell you.
Right.
He's going to give you his opinion. He's going to give you, and he's going to give you backup behind his reasoning of what his opinion means. So yeah, I would say he's more like James R. Hoffa than that. His son was more, I guess I would say, finesse, and more of a politician.
Yeah.
I love counterfactuals, and I always get tunnel vision when they're brought up. I love this, you know, he had connections. Sure, he wasn't going to shy away from them. He wasn't going to plead the fifth. If he had made this case, well, I am an angel, and he avoided controversy, what I'm taking away from this is they would have gone after somebody to disparage labor. Who do you think they go after if they can't go after Hoffa with organized crime? Is there like a runner-up?
You know, a McCall committee looks at other unions, and other unions had issues with corruption. And there were some serious slime ball operations going on that were essentially running, the term is sweetheart contracts, but essentially they were going to employers and saying, we'll sell you a contract that will keep other unions away. And so one was like, it starts out as the United Auto Workers, AFL, but then it comes the Allied Industrial Workers. So that's kind of an example. And then Teamsters Union, and it's very big in New York, called the Toy Workers, Toy and Doll Workers Union. Maybe they organized some toy factories, but so there were these marginal operations that existed, but maybe without that menace of power, right? So was there another union that was powerful in that sense, that was strategic? I guess, you could have said like the International Longshoremen's Association, but they'd already been so targeted in the early 1950s that part of what I think the McClellan Committee was about was, yes, I think it was for people like McClellan, it was about Southern Democrats, and Republicans, it was about finding leverage for pushing through restrictions on unions that they wanted. But that's not true for Robert Kennedy. Like, I like the Kennedys as much as anybody else. But I don't say that they're as nice as everyone thinks they are. It's fine. But that's definitely not him. He didn't start out in 1956 saying, I want to crush the workers in America. But it is clear that they want that political limelight. And it was a season and it was a time where an investigation of union corruption was going to get lots of spotlight. But you weren't going to get that if you targeted the ILA, because they'd already been targeted by the New York Commission investigation in the early 1950s. So I don't know who else they would have gone at. Minorities. Yeah, maybe. It's weird that no one targets them,
Right, no, I mean, the burger and.
I know, right? Yeah. That's the thing, right? So like, Office New York, like, they literally kill them there, right? Yeah.
So maybe that suggests a different question.
Okay.
Why is the most famous labor leader the mythical Hoffa? It's because of the celebrity in the newspapers, and you did a good job of showing how it continually comes back. Every time some old lobster's on his deathbed, he's got a story in another state, another station. But the other question, Jamie, to yours would have been maybe Reuther, and he lived. But you said something that is really telling that we ought to try to figure out what it means. Most people in the country don't know any labor leaders. Now in Michigan, we do.
Right.
Because we're so paradise, right? But I don't, because I've spent most of my life in Michigan, I don't really understand how a person can grow up, especially if they work in the hourly work world and industry, something like that, and not know a couple of national labor leader types. So doesn't that suggest to us that there's a real problem for organized labor in America? That if you say to people, name a labor leader, well, let's make a Hoffa. And this comes up when you dig into the Gallup polls every year that they do about Labor Day. What do you like about unions? Well, they help people. So that they help people thing is growing, and it's growing in popularity and in sport. But when you ask the other side, what do you not like about unions? What do you know about unions that are negative? You always mention corruption. And so we sort of lose on both ends then if we're in the labor movement, in that our leaders aren't famous like Reuther and Hoffa were. And the thing that people think badly about unions is not really a real thing.
Right.
I mean, it's the lady bookkeeper who stole $100,000 4 years ago down the street.
Right.
That's the press that the anti-union consultants bring in. They don't really talk about Hoffa. I guess they feel like they don't need to.
Yeah.
The UAW gave the anti-union people a huge shot in the arm with all of their problems recently.
That's the kind of thing that they, so I don't really have a question in here, but it's just, it's too bad that the labor leader we know the most is the mythical Hoffa.
And I guess kind of what I was trying to say with my constant digs on Scorsese is like, even if you want to like play with the Hoffa story, you could have done it so much better, right? Like there is a real story there, like of a real guy who does real achievements. You know, so if Hoffa is the only name they're going to know, you can still make that much more meaningful and much more informative. If you're going to spend $150 million, why not do it?
That'd be better movie.
Huh?
That'd be better.
Yeah, that's what I think, but.
Well, I never thought about it as mythical and real, right? So I come here tonight, but you guys might find this interesting in this room. So up until, I'd say 3 years ago, and this happened for several years, our joint council on the sleeves used to say, home of James R. Hoffa.
Mhm.
And then local 299, which is his local, that local still used the slogan, home of James R. Hoffa.
Mhm.
And then up until his son was out this last election, retired, when we go to our conventions, and I'm assuming it's permission from James P.
Mhm.
They used to sell the retro shirts, buttons, and I think there are bumper stickers that says, I'm with Hoffa. And it was a remake of the original one, and it looked distorted intentionally. And I remember is when we would show up for negotiations with something that says home of James R. Hoffa, because it's Michigan, I was like, okay, I get it. You know, for whatever reason, that meant something to them because it said home of James R. Hoffa, or I have a sweatshirt that says that, and I wear it at the gym. And it's amazing how many people come up to me at the gym and they'd say, oh,
That's a whole different side of that myth than what I was talking about, right?
That's the
like,
mythical part, right? That's the thing, I remember to see that, and they think we're gonna come in and toss a chair and then show them the trunk of a town car. Right? That's what they think, kind of the whole deal, but that, we were still using that, the home of James R. Hoffa until about 3 years ago.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
But that ties to
No reason, it just kind of.
that labor had power. And that labor having power, which Hoffa represented, is so threatening in America, and maybe not other places, but in America, because there is a political connection to the parties that we don't allow.
Right.
And other countries like Finland, so they have Communist Party, Socialist Party, they're not nearly as afraid of that. And in America, I think, even if Hoffa has nothing to do with communism and socialism, workers having that level of power, that's like the definition.
I do feel it's like a necessary connection, right? So you need to denigrate the threat of union power, and so Hoffa or the theme of corruption. And before there was a Hoffa, there were other leaders that were invoked in this. You and then you. Go ahead.
That's a great question. I just want to know, does anybody as crazy as me, how many times have you watched the Godfather?
That's a good point. It's weirder when you teach, like, so I think I must have seen it 6 or 7 times. This is a weird year, like the last time I taught it, students had never heard of the movie before, and then now I've got these 4 Godfather geeks in the movie, in the class who've seen it. There's one kid was saying that their family watches it every holiday season. I'm like, oh, this is a holiday movie. I've seen On the Waterfront a lot too. Fairness to me. Yeah.
I'm wondering here, is there a point where Hoffa's myth and legacy can be redeemed in a wider public audience? Is it done? Is it cemented at this point? If Scorsese had come out with a very pro-labor, very different story, would it have mattered? If we had named, the next wing of the Reuther, we've got the Fraser Center, and then we have the Hoffa Center coming up next. Like, would this affect the public memory, the social memory, or we?
Well, I guess officially I'm bound to this story, which is that if there's no ending, it is available for retelling. Yeah. The issue is, I guess this is what they always say in communication stage, right? The issue is that message needs to resonate with the audience. And maybe in today's political world, David Witwer's version of a super cool movie about a heroic but problematic Hoffa might not resonate with the audience. And so maybe it wouldn't work. Like, you could tell that story, right? But whether that story would get picked up, that's the issue. But I don't know, there's nothing to stop it, right? It's just whether or not, a message finds a friendly audience in that period. But if like people in the gym are liking like a "don't mess with me" Hoffa, then clearly there's something that's available. Yeah.
It's been a long time since I've seen it, but wasn't that the Jack Nicholson Hoffa kind of a sympathetic now?
Much better than the Irishman. Much better than the Irishman. There is a strike. There is a strike, and he does like lead a strike.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool. And it's very violent. We don't really know why he's leading the strike. We don't know, like, there's no functioning as a union to do that. Yeah. And then, the main character between besides Jack Nicholson is Danny DeVito, who is, he's the equivalent of all these guys. He's like Hoffa's thug. And he's Hoffa's sidekick, but he's a total thug. That's the only one that, so like I like it a lot better after The Irishman, but at the time I didn't think. And you don't really know, like, I don't know if you've seen it, but you don't, like, I saw it with people back when it came out, because even then it was my first Teamsters book, and people were mainly confused. They didn't really know the history of what's occurring, because the strike occurs. I know it's in the 30s, and I'm pretty sure it's a riff on the Minneapolis Teamsters strike in 1934, but I only know that because, I have a Ph.D. labor history, but I don't think anyone else knows what's going on. Why are these guys fighting each other? There's a movie before that, Sylvester Stallone, and I think that movie's called Fist. And I'll only tell you, because I know you guys will promise not to tell anybody else, I haven't seen this, but not widely available, but it's because it's closer. I think it comes in 76 or 77. And it's about a guy, his name isn't Hoffa, but it's clearly based on Hoffa, played by Special. And he does organize actual workers, and then he does become kind of corrupted. But the sense is it's closer to the actual history than what you would get, later on. And I do think there's a way in which the further we get away from the actual historic Hoffa, the harder and harder it gets to have a recreation that has anything to do with that.
Counter that argument. I mean, we see it all throughout history that it's very malleable with people's opinions. People looked at Christopher Columbus like he was the God-sent hero. And then as we learned more, we realized, oh wait, dude's not that great. And same thing can happen with Hoffa. I mean, it's just a question of how long will it take for that to happen.
Yeah.
Even with Columbus, though, there's people organizing to tell that story and push it out, right? It's intentionality that then the story gets legs and it starts traveling and moving, and then that becomes a movement that affects society. And if someone wanted to shift the narrative on Hoffa, it would have to be really intentional. Force would have to be pushing out there. You'd have to have some sort of platform that will start to catch on. You'd have to have people wanting to buy in. I mean, the labor movement today, try to tell the story, right? Get that going out there to ship attention to it. But it's not just going to come from a history book. It has to come from people saying, hey, read this history.
Right.
With that idea, though, we do have the worldwide web and social media. People, if they wanted to start the campaign, it could take off. Yeah. It's possible.
I think we'd like to thank you for really entertaining.